Hey folks, and welcome to Typology, the show on which we explore the story of you through the lens of the Enneagram. My name is Anthony Skinner, producer of the show. I'm so excited about the next 4 weeks. We're talking about how are you feeding your brain? You heard me right. How are you feeding your brain? Hey, this is like, I know that I say this every week, but super special guest. Let me just go ahead and jump right in and tell you. Wait, before I get to that, I have to tell you about this. Listen, we've had incredible feedback on our couple series we ran over the past 4 weeks. We've been talking about how knowing your Enneagram type can help you identify the ways you best give and receive love, communicate with your loved ones, and connect with your partner. And of course, learning how your personalities interact with each other is an absolute game changer. So for that reason, I'm excited to share in just a few weeks, Ian is hosting a free webinar. That's right, FREE, free webinar on how the Enneagram can strengthen your relationships. Make sure you join Ian on Wednesday, June 29 at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time to learn how the Enneagram can help you overcome persistent challenges and find lasting joy with your partner. Just visit ianmorgancron.com/relationships. That's ianmorgancron.com/relationships to register. Okay, now let me get to our guest, because this is like a thrill right here. Again, all this month, we're talking about how to feed your brain. And to kick that off, we've got father and son duo, Dr. Rick and Forrest Hanson. Dr. Rick Hansen is a Ph.D., Type 7, is a psychologist, senior fellow at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, and a New York Times bestselling author. He's the author of 6 books that have been published in 30 languages. He's lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard. He's taught in meditation centers worldwide. He's an expert on positive neuroplasticity, and his work's been featured on CBS, NPR, the BBC, and other major media outlets. He began meditating in 1974, and he's the founder of Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom. Forrest Hanson, his son, Type 6, is a best-selling author and the host and producer of the Being Well podcast. Being Well is a weekly podcast that features conversations between Dr. Rick Hansen, Forrest, and a variety of world-class experts. We've got them both on the show for you today. Type 7, Type 6. We're talking neuroplasticity, neuroscience, how to feed your brain, lots and lots of good stuff. Super glad you're here, people. That's it for me, Anthony Skinner. And without any further ado, here is the host of our show, Ian Crum.
Hello, Typology Tribe. I am so excited today for our 2 guests to join us. I want to introduce to you Dr. Rick Hansen, his son, Forrest Hanson. He is the author of Neurodharma, Science, Ancient Wisdom, 7 Practices of the Highest Happiness. He's author of Buddha's Brain, the Practical Neuroscience of Happiness, Love, and Wisdom, a book that I greatly enjoyed. Welcome, Forrest and Rick. We're so happy to have you here.
Oh, really glad to be here. And I should also put in a plug for Forrest, co-author of our recent book, Resilient, How to Grow an Unshakable Core of Calm, Strength, and Happiness.
You had to get the authorial plug for me in there somewhere, Dad. I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's well-deserved. It's well-deserved.
Well, and Forrest, I recently was on a podcast with you.
Yep. Yeah. Being Well, that's the podcast that we normally do together, Rick and I. Rick was recovering from a shoulder procedure, so unfortunately he couldn't make our conversation, but we had a great time talking. It was great to talk with you, Ian.
Well, we're going to make up for that today. So
for sure.
I am thrilled. So, Rick, you identify as an Enneagram 7, a social 7. I was impressed that you knew the subtype. And Forrest, you are a 6.
Yes, I'm a 6. I'm in the counterphobic variety. So
the counterphobic,
classic push against the concerns.
That's right. All that little bit of oppositional energy happening in there, right?
Absolutely.
Under its core is a little bit of anxiety, though, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. My mom was a phobic 6, or is a phobic 6, I should say. And so we had a pretty fun time ping-ponging against each other when I was younger. Her concern, my pushing away of the concern. Yeah, really, really healthy family dynamic, as you can imagine, but we worked through it.
Well, let's just start there for a moment. Rick, you, prior to our hitting record, you were talking about your experience with the Enneagram going back a long time. Can you just sort of give us a overview of your exposure to the Enneagram?
Yeah, short version is that I encountered it through two men who were engaged with consulting with attorneys about jury selection in big high-profile trials. There's a whole kind of sub-profession of people who do that. And they were using the Enneagram in part to type jurors with regard to particular issues that might arise, during the trial, and then informing the attorneys who are making choices about who to let in and not let in. And at one level, it seemed a little bit like almost cheating, and yet on the other hand, this kind of process happens all the time with jury selection. So they talked with me a little bit, and I did some business type work for them. I was about 26 or 7 at the time, and they typed me as a social 7. And I walked away from that, and I learned a bit about the Enneagram in general and my own type in particular, and I was depressed for 3 days. I just felt horrible because I was just dropped into facing the narcissistic injury, to unpack that term, the impact in a stable, loving, decent, lower middle class, suburban LA upbringing. Nonetheless, 10,000 deficits, right? The absence of the good can be just as consequential as the presence of the bad. 10,000 little moments where there was a lack of mirroring, attunement, empathic resonance with my parents and then with my peers, because I was about 1.5 years or 2 years younger than most kids in school because I skipped a grade and I have an extremely late birthday. So the net of all that was that there was this longing for prizing and mirroring and inclusion that had been unmet. So then around it, I was really pushy about getting those kind of supplies, and with a lot of repressed and disowned sorrow and inadequacy underneath it all. So I just dropped through the through the ice into that murky, smelly pool, for those 3 days, and then somehow, I don't know, I just kind of dusted myself off, and I was like, all right, I got it. I really need to deal with my dilettantism, my kind of Pied Piperishness and my endless planning and deferring commitment to this and that, and just take a big breath and get going. And I wished I had encountered the Enneagram when I was 17 rather than when I was 27. It would have saved me 10 years probably of just wandering in a lot of ways, kind of in the realm of the hungry ghost, if you know that Buddhist metaphor, which for me is a little bit apt for certain aspects of narcissistic hunger. And maybe I'll just finish by saying that of all the personality systems I've been trained in as a long-time clinical psychologist, I consider the Enneagram to be the most accurate generally. It's the most informative, it's the richest, people fit it the best of really any system I know. I think that any system on any given day that can kind of account for at least about 50% of who you are, given individual variation, that's a fantastic system. And the Enneagram is definitely that, I think, for most people.
I know that you are a pioneer in the world of positive psychology. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, no, the spin I would put on it, just to preempt, certain considerations, is that I really focus on the process of growing inner resources, strengths inside, in a very almost old school, self-reliant kind of way. How do you develop grit, patience, compassion, insight, moral inclinations, commitment to exercise or sobriety, whatever it is you want to grow inside, including happiness altogether. And so the process of doing that involves opening to beneficial experiences of these various inner resources, and then helping those experiences lead to lasting change in your nervous system, so that you're moving from states to traits and developing lasting healing, growing, and awakening. So I would say that's my own particular focus on that. It could be summarized as taking in the good that would be trivialized by thinking that it is merely a matter of smelling the roses along the way. Yeah, smell the roses along the way. But the point for me is really focused in a kind of clear-eyed take about how do we actually grow stably, resilient well-being in the core of our being, so that we're more equipped to deal with the challenges of life and also have happiness along the way.
Yes. And I only say this because we recently had an Enneagram 7. This happens a lot with us, right? With authors who come on. And the name of his new book, which is a New York Times bestseller right now, is called Undistracted, which just made me laugh my head off. And then because, of course, a major trait of Enneagram 7s is this monkey mind, right? This sort of like a hummingbird moving from one flower to the next, with fascination and curiosity, but oftentimes never probing into its very depths, And then when I was researching for our conversation today, and I saw that there were a number of articles and YouTube things on there about your work in the realm of positive psychology, and I was like, well, of course.
Right, it would be very on brand, absolutely.
I mean,
and this is where I'm sure we'll get into it, like the more or less evolved versions of each type, as it were. The image of the Enneagram 7 of Errol Flynn swinging across the pit full of alligators with a big grin on his face, right? Swinging on a vine across the pit. I mean, there is that defensive movement away from suffering. But I think that, on the other hand, as we grow different kind of strengths inside, including positive mood, we become more equipped to face the suffering that resides in our own heart and in the hearts of other people.
Yes.
And so for me, seven-ishness, it's actually served me well in some ways, because it's actually helped me find refuges inside myself and looking out at the world from which I can face and bear and process and open to my own pain.
So beautifully said. And I think what you're talking about there is an evolved awakened 7, right? And maybe the best way I could maybe describe that is when we think about the waterline of consciousness and what's above the waterline, right?
Yeah.
And the more material we can bring out from under the waterline of consciousness into the realm of the conscious, right? The better off we're going to be, right? It might be hurt, it might be painful, it may be hard to work through, but the better off we're going to be. And I think when I talk about an evolved type, I think about the journey of the person intentionally doing that work to face the shadow aspects, the strength aspects, right? Not to get, mired in those particular areas of our life that are challenges, but as you would say, to also then draw out resources from the strengths of that type to create more resilience and strength and awakening and happiness and all of those things. And I think you're self-describing when you talk about your experience, that you have, you're an evolved 7, right? That has
work
done
in
the
progress.
Work. Well, we all
aided
are.
by my son routinely.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And speaking of your son, Forrest, you are a 6 on the Enneagram. You're you identify as a counterphobic 6. Tell me about that. Tell me about that journey and your journey with the Enneagram.
Yeah. Totally. As you might imagine, first time I bumped into it was around the dinner table. I was probably 12-ish years old, 13-ish years old. So I got a very early introduction to it. And I have no idea how we got into it, but I know that I immediately took to it. I really enjoyed the system. I thought that it was so descriptive. That's part of why I liked it. It felt, I was very into playing fantasy games as a kid. So these felt like classes that people were in, kind of, if you've ever played a fantasy video game. But I myself didn't feel very well described by it. Even as I aged in my early 20s, still didn't feel very well described by it. I was falling into that kind of 50% of people, or maybe less than that, who, even if they like the system, they don't necessarily feel like it speaks to their nature, their heart. As you know, though, 6s are kind of tricky to describe sometimes because they're one of the few types that is broken into these different aspects. And I was talking, I actually had the great opportunity to talk with Sleeping at Last. He's got a great podcast on the Enneagram, on our podcast, Being Well. And one of the things that he said is he was like, yeah, we have a hard time talking about 6s. And I think that that's pretty true because of these split aspects. And I finally ran into the idea of a counterphobic 6. And I went, oh my God, here it is. This is me. Because I don't really relate to the imagery that we often have about a phobic 6 constantly searching for the exit or really always looking outside of the self for something else to attach to. That didn't necessarily speak to me. But the more that I drilled into it, the more that I realized that the way in which I was doing this was much more abstract, and it was much more about pushing away the potential for anxiety-provoking experiences, coming up with all the reasons I didn't need to be worried about something, the reasons that it was just going to work out okay for me in the end. All of that, very much a central part of my personality. And the ideas that I was attaching to, that idea of like the 6 as the loyalist, which for me, I was like, I mean, I think of myself as being a loyal person, but that is my whole phenotype. I don't know about that one. But I realized what I was doing is I was applying this to like big ideas, big structures of thought. I was looking for the people who I thought were really smart and really new. And then I went, oh yeah, that's it. I'm going to trust that. So it was a sort of searching outside of the self for affirmation and for identity. And I think that that's something that I'm still really involved in.
Well, you actually described some features of 6s in a beautiful way, which is, for example, when I'm leading corporate workshops or just, workshops in the general public, someone will come up to me at the end of the day and they'll be like, what number on the Enneagram can't figure out their number on the Enneagram when they get to the end of the workshop? And I went, maybe you're a 6.
6s or 9s probably.
6s, yeah. 6s, but really 6s are the one that really struggle to figure out their type, because they struggle with ambivalence. And there's a lot of self-questioning that goes on in the mind of a 6.
Yeah.
The other reason a counterphobic 6 would struggle with it is because you are fundamentally suspicious at first.
And so this was another element of it that I was like, yes, this is me to a T. Absolutely. Like my dad's laughing probably off to the side right now, because I am Captain Questioner. Absolutely. I really like things that feel, to me, quote unquote, evidence-based. It's why I really struggled with spirituality and a lot of existentialism initially when I first started bumping into it. And I really had this very dogmatic, logician-driven view of the world that I think I softened a little bit over the years as I've gotten more comfortable with don't know mind, or giving it up to the things that are unknowable, or however you want to frame that. Those have become more healthily integrated, but they were total stumbling blocks for me.
And what you're describing there really is a very evolved 6, right? This capacity to live with a sense of peace when there's a lack of certitude. I think that really is the part of the journey of the 6th into self-awareness and positive integration, is this capacity to be like, and also the capacity to say, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And to just sort of carry that mantle, not in a naive way, but in a profoundly deep way. This sense that the universe can be trusted, that as James Houston would say, like the ultimate question, I think it was Houston that said that, the biggest question we have to answer is the universe, maybe it was Einstein, is the universe a safe place in which to live, Yeah. And for 6s to be able to say, I think so, it's
You said that so beautifully there, Ian. I just want to kind of give you credit. I think that was such a wonderful way to frame that. And for me, I often find conversations about the Enneagram to be very emotionally evoking. I don't know if that's your experience or not, because we're playing with powerful forces, right? You're talking about the nature of safety and security out in the world, and this deep process of identity seeking. And for me in my own journey with it, I'm at the point where I'm aware of these processes inside of my system. And also, I'm 34. I'm still figuring a lot of stuff out. I'm still going on the adventure. So the awareness is there. The application is not always consistently there. But we've gotten through the awareness stage, which is good.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. That is fantastic. Yeah. I'm oftentimes telling people, Forrest, that when they first get around the Enneagram, they get almost radicalized by it. They just can't. They just think to themselves, "This is it. This completely explains who I am," and they get a little frothy mouthed, and I'm a little bit like, because you are not actually your personality, right? Your personality is not who you are. It's a feature of who you are, but it isn't who you are. There's so much behind the persona, the mask, that and there's the complexity, the spirituality, the mystery, all of those kinds of things that we have to take into account when we are talking about the human person. And also we have to, I think, in my opinion, always sort of maintain this posture of agnosticism, this space of not knowing, and then also being okay with the not knowing, you know?
That's a really interesting point you're making there, Ian, that relates to what Forrest was saying about skepticism, or I would introduce the word doubt. And before we started, we were talking a little bit about mapping from, let's say, Buddhist typologies of people or factors within people to pay attention to into the Enneagram. And one of the systems from early Buddhism refers to these hindrances, these 5 things that actually the deep translation of the original word is that these are coverings over of our underlying radiant, healthy, true nature, who we really are, that you were alluding to a moment ago. And so the point I'm just making is that one of those 5, and in many ways the most pernicious of the 5, is doubt, because anything can be doubted ultimately, right? And there's such a distinction between doubt and not knowing, right? And you're really talking about a kind of openness and spaciousness of don't know. Beginner's mind, right? As Suzuki Roshi talked about, which is a way for 6s, but I think really for everybody to realize, there's a distinction between being identified with the machinery of doubt and getting caught up in that, which has a kind of corrosive impact eventually, because then it leaves you feeling completely unsettled and ungrounded. That's really different from a spaciousness of don't know, could be, maybe so.
Yes, I love that. And I do agree that I think that's a good posture for all of us to take, to begin to reconcile ourselves with groundlessness, right?
Groundlessness,
This is the way the world is. And I have to learn, because when we deny the groundlessness of life, we create so much anxiety or resignation or despair, you know.
One of the things that has really served me about that is the two truths side by side. On the one hand, reality is in effect like being on the 20th floor and you're about to take an elevator, the doors open, you step in and koosh, there's nothing beneath your feet, second by second by second, continuously. That's the groundlessness. On the other hand, reality endlessly renews itself. It's endlessly arising with this profound generosity at the heart, right, of the present moment, continually arising. And being aware of the arisingness can help people tolerate the emptiness, groundlessness that's also true.
Beautifully said. We're going to talk about your new book, Neurodharma, in just a second, because I really want to dive into it and encourage people to get their hand on it. But I do want to ask another a question that's a little bit more personal. All right, so Forrest, the question I have for you is, in your upbringing with a 7 dad as a 6, what did you?
I love this.
What did you love most? What did you love most? And that actually could maybe be, what do you love, and what did you love most about your father? And what were maybe 1 or 2 of the greatest challenges as a 6 growing up with a 7 dad?
Wow, what a question. Yeah, man.
I hope we're recording this.
Oh, jeez. Wow, what a question. Sorry, I'm just gonna take a second to chew on it because I want to give an answer worthy of the question. Just being super transparent about it, my dad, for all of his ability to be in the office and plug away extremely diligently on a book for 12 hours, literally in a day, day after day, if required to do it. I mean, the man has a prodigious work ethic, and I don't just say that because he's on the call right now. It's just 100% true. Has a total playful party aspect side that most of my friends have seen at least once. And every time that they see it, they're like, wow, your dad can go if that's what's going on. And that was, I think, an aspect as a kid that was great and remains great to this day, because I was a very extroverted, like playful child. I wanted to run around and throw the ball in the yard and all of that. And I think that those were very much aspects of my dad's personality that we're super present in the field and are also very consistent with that underlying, swinging from tree to tree nature that is kind of present in the 7. So that was definitely a positive part. I think the only thing that I would look at as a negative aspect or a way in which our parts kind of bumped into each other, because I have a wing in 7. So I'm a 6 with a wing in 7. So definitely open to those aspects. In times maybe where I was feeling a little bit extra anxious about something, particularly around like some physical safety stuff. My dad's a rock climber. He's very outdoorsy. And I'm probably predictably afraid of heights. And I don't like being in an object that's moving faster than the speed that I can control. And so these were things that probably wigged me out a little bit more than they wigged my dad out. And my dad very accurately was like, hey, it's going to be okay. It's perfectly safe objectively. And I was like, yeah, but it doesn't feel safe to me. So that might be a way in which our personalities kind of bumped in each other in a slightly more challenging way for probably both of us.
Oh, well, beautifully described. Now let's flip that on its head, and I want to hear from you, Rick. Like,
I love this.
Like, what do you love most about Forrest, right? And we're thinking about this through the lens of the Enneagram a little bit. And then what were some of the challenges of parenting a 6?
Wow. I mean, I love Forrest, period, and I love and respect just so many things about him. And in terms of the frame of your question, it's interesting that one thing that comes up for me that I don't know the Enneagram system deeply. Maybe it's also a hallmark of my 7-ishness that I understand my type really pretty well, but other people, whatever, you're on your own a little bit, not exactly, but so I'm very open to correction here. But what I think about you, Forrest, kind of say it to you directly, that was so characteristic of you always was this profound sense of justice and deep commitment to justice and fair play. Now, to bring in another system, maybe it's because you're also a Libra, which I'm on the tail end of Libra-ness, given my birthday and rising signs and whatnot. Libra Scorpio, actually 60-40 Libra, 40 Scorpio actually describes me pretty well too. If you really want to get into the weeds. But Forrest just always was incredibly committed to fair play, profound integrity, decency, support for others, troubled by people who weren't being fair. And I wonder about, I guess I think of it almost like the other side of the coin of doubt, the very intense feeling for justice. And maybe that's the loyalty, loyal to justice. So, and justice seeking. And I think that's just been super central for Forrest. And it makes him completely trustworthy as a person. Oh, you can completely trust Forrest, whatever, just bone deep, trustworthy in the core of his being. So, it's great. It's great to have I don't know if either you guys, Anthony or Ian or parents, but to feel like your kid has bone deep integrity, it's just one of the most beautiful things to have, is to feel as a parent and know is really true. Wow, my kid has profound integrity. Both our kids do. And
interesting. I have my oldest is a 6, and I have the same. I mean, it resonates with what you're saying. I could say the same thing about him.
That's interesting.
And I was going to ask. I'm glad that you said that, Forrest. That you wing 7. Rick, do you know where you wing?
I really can go both ways. I mean, this is where it gets kind of complicated. I'm a very peaceable person, and I'm skeptical, and I'm analytic, and it's my nature. I'm to slow down and really try to understand things. On the other hand, I think of it a little bit like my dad's culture coming through North Dakota, growing up on a ranch there, where you're really polite, but at a certain point, it's like, hello, 8. And with a real strong feeling of justice and loyalty there as well, loyalty to the downtrodden. And at a certain point, no, do not mess with me when it comes to people I care about. So I also think of that a little bit as another metaphor, my Scottishness. On the one hand, very analytical, very philosophical, good in business. On the other hand, do not mess with Braveheart.
Beautiful. So good to hear a dad. We've never done that, right?
Yeah,
that was cool. Good for you, Ian. That took courage.
Well,
that's really lovely.
What's your type, Ian?
I am a 4. I am a 4 that If you had known me as a young man, that would have been a lot more obvious.
Yeah, I can feel that. It's so male force. It's harder to kind of track. It's not so much a cultural. The female force, the ingenue character, obviously in a lot of film, it's a well-known type. But in men, we don't see it. We don't recognize it so readily. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was a very sensitive kid. I was very much an artist. I was drawn to it. I was very attuned to beauty and aesthetics. I loved poetry. I loved songwriting. I also I learned to love my own suffering. I also, probably in my 20s, would have said I was addicted to my own suffering. I organized my identity around the suffering of my early childhood, which was profound. I had a father who died of alcoholism and drug addiction. Growing up with that was a real challenge, as you can imagine. Lapsed into my own addiction to drugs and alcohol, and there was just a lot of very foolish material, happening there, and it took a lot of work, I think. And to your point, I love what you said about this core that is. That personality tends to mask, right? And if we think about personality as a constellation of adaptive stratagems and things like that we use as a defense, right, against core wounds, right, and even trauma, early trauma. These are ways that we've learned to cope and to get our needs met in the world, in the face of a world that's overwhelming, right, as a little person, and so. We in the Enneagram world would talk about essence, that there is a core essence that cannot be damaged or wounded. In some traditions, Richard Rohr would call it the Immortal Diamond. If another would be Thomas Merton would speak about this as well. This idea that at the human core there is an original goodness, a strength, a resilience, a beauty. And in fact, I think it was Merton who speaks about I'm going to get the term wrong, the secret beauty, or the hidden wholeness is what he calls it, the hidden wholeness. And so part of the work in the Enneagram is how do we begin to deconstruct those negative dimensions of personality that stand or in the way. They veil essence, they veil that original goodness, that hidden wholeness. And I think that's actually a pretty good, or maybe that would align with some of your work beautifully, right? And of course, in the realm of positive psychology, for sure, as I understand positive psychology, which is not, doesn't have a great deal of depth, that rather than when a person comes into the office, say, okay, what's your problem, right? Like, let's focus on the problem, or let's even pathologize and label the problem. Why don't we focus on some of those other dimensions, aspects, experiences that a person has had that can be built upon, that from which resilience and self-compassion, self-understanding can be developed. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, and you're giving me a notion, Ian, and I'm very interested in your take, Forrest, because Forrest is like, in a sense, I had a friend who was deep into literature, and he said there were probably about 6 basic storylines, and one of them is a stranger comes to town. Yes. In all kinds of ways. And in some ways, Forrest is the stranger who's come to the town broadly of mental health, who sees it more clearly than many of the people, like including me, who've been living there for a long time, because we're just awash in it already. So Forrest, feel free to really jump in here. I actually would think not so much in terms of positive psychology, but comprehensive psychology, inclusive psychology, that if you think of the range of human experience roughly from, to simplify, -10 to +10, if Freud and others were principally interested within a medical model on -10 to 0, just breaking the waterline, get your nose just above it so you're as Freud described it, a normal neurotic, and that's all it was. Well, that's just half the human story. The other half of the human story, obviously, is above the waterline. And actually, the ultimate human story is the spaciousness, the ground that's beautiful, radiant, and pure already, that contains that continuum from -10 to +10 in terms of how the mind operates. So I'm really interested in a comprehensive psychology, and also very pragmatically, because it's through internalizing strengths that we experience above the waterline that we are then more able to deal with what's beneath the waterline and the currents that keep trying to suck us under. So I would kind of, describe myself in that way. And yeah, I think I'll just stop there and see what you think, Forrest, as the as the visitor to this town.
As the visitor to
what do you think
town.
of this notion of comprehensive psychology?
For starters, I think it's totally consistent with the work that we do generally and the idea of integrating these different parts, right? Because what you described there, Ian, is essentially the human story, right? We pop out with something, call it true nature, call it whatever you want. And then things happen to us. And then we develop a variety of different strategies, behaviors, approaches based on the fact that these things happen to us that start to cover over that core nature, right? The world pushes on us, we push back. It's a tragic story in some ways. Like the human story is a little tragic in that sense.
Yeah.
And for me, one of the things that I've developed an increasing appreciation for, and maybe this has a bit of a positive psychology lens to it, is the way in which our brain, body, heart system is incredibly intelligent. And the coping behaviors that people develop are there for reasons, 99.99999% of the time. So if you are listening to this and you feel like you have a behavior that is quote unquote problematic or quote unquote maladaptive, whatever the words are negative that we use to label these experiences, there's an extremely good chance that that behavior was actually not only understandable, but actually a survival mechanism for whatever circumstances you were going through back then. And then the question is, of course, do you still need that behavior these days? And that is the central question. Do you still need that behavior these days? And we have to go through this elaborate process of unspooling ourselves from that behavior that's now causing us pain that back in the day was actually really useful. But there's a phrase that you're probably familiar with, Ian. It's allying with the defense. And it's a classic strategy where somebody walks into the office and the therapist essentially has two options. They can say, yeah, that behavior's bad, you shouldn't do it anymore. Or they can say, here are these aspects of that behavior that make sense, right? And then they can move from there into going, okay, but what do we want to do about it? Most of the time, the second way is the way to go. And that's a lesson that we can take into our own lives too.
This goes to show you like the mystery of cross-pollination, right? Because you guys might as well be teaching the Enneagram right now.
That's right.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
You just might as well be teaching the Enneagram, and it's so exciting. When I find truth in multiple disciplines or multiple spiritual traditions, I'm like, well, pay attention. Pay attention. Because when you see it paraded out over and over and over again, it means that there must be some core truth that people from different backgrounds have seen over and over and over again. And I find that so fascinating. Now that brings me to this question, Rick. I want to talk about the neuroscience of awakening. Okay, I want to talk.
All right.
Okay, I want to talk.
What have we been waiting for?
What have we been waiting for?
Let's get to it.
Let's have at it. So, there's a friend of mine who's a Catholic theologian, a wonderful, wonderful guy. And he once said, if you took all of the teachings of the Christian mystics, St. John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, St. Teresa of Avila, on and on and on, Catherine of Siena, he said, if you were to try and summarize all of their teachings and compress it into one short statement, he said it would come down to this: wake up. He said, that's it. That is the summary of all the great teachings of the Christian mystics, right? And of course, I guess you might agree with that, right? That part of the journey of to enlightenment, to awakening, these are words that, for example, Christians should not be afraid of, because I do believe they're in the tradition. Let's talk about the neuroscience of awakening and what it's about, and what you've learned and what you're excited about with it.
Huge topic. If you'll allow me, I'll introduce it with a metaphor from early Buddhism that practice, whether it's Christian practice, whether it's therapeutic practice, whether it's Buddhist practice, whatever it is, basically is a cart with two wheels following two tracks. And one of those tracks is the process of developmental change. We gradually heal from certain things. We evolve, let's say, in the way we operate in the world as our Enneagram type. We cultivate certain qualities, compassion, mindfulness, wisdom, and so forth. It's a developmental process. The other track is about our true nature already. The ground of being already that's universal, transpersonal, present in all of us, actually present in everything, not simply in the human consciousness. And that's a view at bottom of the divine, actually, as the ground of all in a kind of non-dual, immanent kind of sense. So both are really important. For myself, I was very good at and engaged with that first track, grinding away. Forrest knows me as a grinder. I just develop, I chip away, I keep at it. I trust that process, right? And it's really, I've always had an intuition of true nature and the ultimate divinity, really, that underlies everything, and is the basis of everything and the nature of everything. But mostly I worked on that first track. And it's really in the last several years that I've gotten more engaged in the other one, which is about the recognition of true nature already. They go together, as you can appreciate, and I'm sure you know this already, and they support each other. And, if you tend toward one, it's often good to bring in the balance of the other. So that's kind of a framework then for me to say that what struck me about really across all traditions, certainly in the Buddhist tradition that I know well. I know a little bit about Christian contemplative practice, not too much. I mean, I was raised a casual Methodist. We went to church twice a year, Easter and Christmas, basically, and maybe a third time when my dad's mother would come to town and visit us on our way to Disneyland. But anyway, so in terms of what I see, though, is I see 7 qualities that are really fulfilled in the saints and sages and great teachers, and also individuals that are not famous, but we can look at them and go, wow, you're really pretty transparent to the divine. You really are pretty far along. You even under great pressure, you don't lose it. You're really kind of cooked. So what are these qualities that we see in these people that we have latent within ourselves, or to some extent in ourselves, that we can develop along the way, informed now, 2,000 years after Jesus walked the earth, 2,500 years after the Buddha walked the earth? We know a few things now about our own biology and nervous system. How can we draw upon that knowledge that we've acquired to cultivate these 7 qualities, which I'll name in just a moment and then kick it back to you. So that's kind of the frame of the book, Neurodharma. And it really gets at the point that we can know ourselves in 2 ways. From the inside out, subjectively, from what's called a first-person perspective, as well as second, objectively, from the outside in, the third-person perspective. In a kind of a shorthand, Dharma is in fact is a way of knowing yourself from the inside out. Neuro is a way of knowing yourself from the outside in. And Neurodharma is really where these 2 perspectives meet, which is full of opportunity for understanding yourself and practicing skillfully. So to finish then, the 7 qualities, I'll just name them, and we can think about, we all have a sense of each of these, and we can recognize that they're really perfected, they're really fulfilled in people who are very, very far along. So steadying the mind, and I'll state them as practices, because that's what they are in effect. Steadying the mind, warming the heart, resting in fullness, which is a way of talking about equanimity and emotional balance, and not being driven by craving, subtle and gross. So those first 3, steadiness, lovingness, fullness, they're pretty familiar to us. Then we have the next 3, being wholeness, a sense of being whole, everything included, undivided, accepting yourself fully, and being aware of the sense of the mind stream as a whole, being wholeness. 5th, receiving nowness. Really resting at the front edge of now, that emergent edge that we talked about earlier, that is both passing away continuously and being endlessly renewed. Receiving, nowness. 6th, I call it opening into allness, which is a way of talking about a sense of the self-world boundary becoming more diffuse, becoming softer, blurrier, feeling sometimes one truly with everything, recognizing that this moment of existence is a local expression really of the universe as a whole, opening into allness. And then we have last, I call it finding timelessness, that opening into that which, as the Buddha put it, is unconditioned, distinct from the conditioned unfolding of the Big Bang universe, and recognizing that sense within ourselves of what is timeless, absolute, full of possibility, and potentially, and this is how I feel it too, infused with a kind of transpersonal awareness of some kind, mysteriously, and even love. So those are the 7. Steadiness, lovingness, fullness, wholeness, nowness, allness, timelessness. And you can just feel them, and you can feel the ways in which they can be developed. And so what that book's about is a serious crack at, okay, let's take a look at it. How are each one of these 7 qualities affected by the operation of your own nervous system? As we understand it so far, neuroscience is a baby science, but we know more than nothing. So let's make use of this something that we actually do know, and have a kind of delight about it, and a joy, and an inquiry. And so the book actually does explore what in the world is going on in your brain when you feel one with everything, rested in the present moment with an open heart, completely at peace. What's going on in your brain when that's the case? And by understanding that, how can you strengthen those neural circuits and increasingly develop those qualities in yourself, those 7 qualities, as stable traits?
Wow.
Yeah.
Good stuff. I like it already. Yeah. It's interesting. You're also describing, I think, things that in the Christian tradition are true, right? I was just thinking about James Finley. I was thinking about Richard Rohr's work on the cosmic Christ. I was thinking about Merton, who I love. I love Merton. And I was actually thinking about the great Catholic mystics, that what you're describing is so aligned with what they have to. And I'm always telling people, Christianity is a Near Eastern religion. But anyway, let us not forget. And so I just love this idea, because I think this was certainly a Franciscan idea. He talked about the great chain of being, and this idea about the interconnectedness of all things.
Yeah.
I think I won't bore people with the story, or you with the story, but maybe at a later date. I had an experience of just a profound experience as a little boy one time, and it lasted about 8 seconds. And I would characterize it as a truly mystical experience. It was uninvited, unbidden. I didn't know it was coming. I was not thinking of, I was 8 years old. What do I know, right? Riding a bike down the street. And I had this out of nowhere on this beautiful fall New England day, on an empty street at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. I remember exactly where I was. I can remember the maples changing in fall against this azure blue sky, and this sense out of nowhere that everything was all right. And that I was part of some great chain of being. I could not have, explained it this way as a child. All I knew is that I was in the profound presence of some higher power that was personal and that loved me, and knew me, and it may be Forrest, to good news to a 6, had my back. And so these potentials are in us. I think so much of spirituality is learning to know what you know. Learning to know what you already know. Okay, so you have these 7. I'm not sure how to describe them.
Qualities. And ways of being. There's a term you can take: the fruit is the path. Right. So they're both the results of practice and methods of practice.
Right. But there are 7. This is not a book that just sort of sits around in the ether and talks about abstract ideas. There's some very practical step-by-step things that people can do based on neuroscience to develop these traits, if you will, or these ways of being in the world, of moving through the world, of showing up for life. Can you just give me a sample of, maybe I should ask Forrest to give me samples of it because I feel like I'm ignoring you, Forrest. I'll get back to you. Don't panic.
I feel great.
Rick, can you just tell folks a little bit about those practices, the practical things we can do to
Yeah. It's great. So I'll give you just a couple examples, right? And these are things that people can start doing immediately. So let's start, let's say, with resting in fullness, which goes to the ways in which in our own biology, you may know the title of the book on stress from Robert Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, right? And the thing is, when we feel authentically in the moment that our needs are sufficiently met, the body biologically defaults to what Forrest and I call the green zone, in which there's a sense of renewal, repair, recovery, conservation of resources biologically in the body and in the mind in terms of our three major needs, which could be structured as safety, satisfaction, and connection. There is, respectively, a basic sense of calm or peacefulness, a sense of fullness and contentment in terms of satisfaction, and a sense of lovingness, open-heartedness, warm-heartedness, friendliness, simple, ordinary friendliness in terms of our needs for connection. That's our resting state. That's our home base when we're not driven from home by a sense of a invasive, unmet need. The takeaway from that is that people can repeatedly internalize genuine experiences of, okay, in this moment, I'm basically all right now, which is manna from heaven for sixes. Basically, my whole family, we're all a bunch of fear points. Our daughter's a 5. I think I could say that as well. And so here we are, that you're actually all right in the moment. You can let that sink in. In the moment, you're not starving. You're not always basically okay in the moment, but if in the moment you have the basis for a genuine sense of gratitude, gladness, contentment, a sense of you've accomplished so much already, goals are being attained continuously in the present, you can then rest in a sense of contentment. Similarly, when you have a sense of warm-heartedness flowing out or flowing in, you can rest in the sense of that, which, in the famous saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. As you sustain these experiences, feel them in an embodied way, and have a sense of what's rewarding about them, what feels good about them, those are neural factors. Those are factors of neuroplastic change. You are gradually hardwiring into yourself traits of resting state, peacefulness, contentment, and love. So I would really encourage people to think about, half a dozen times a day, not a big deal, inside your own being, when you actually have the authentic opportunity to feel relatively safe, satisfied, or connected, slow down and take in the good for a breath or longer. Let that really, really sink in, and it'll change your experience of that day. If you say to yourself, I'm going to do it today, half a dozen times, it'll change your day. If you do it 3 days in a row, you'll notice that your inner being will start to shift. If you do it 10 days in a row, people will ask you, hey, what, are you on drugs? What's gotten into you? Are you on some new diet? What's up? Because something has gradually shifted inside. You feel more full continuously. That's one. Here's the second one that's really cool from cutting edge neuroscience. And people can do it if they want on their own. If you look down and near your body, like within 3-5 feet of yourself, that naturally tends to force a self-referential, egocentric kind of perspective, which makes sense if you imagine our ancestors 10 million years ago, right? Back in Jurassic Park, even further back in time, let's say, in that. Their friend or foe is really close. You gotta be on your toes for that. But if you lift your gaze toward the horizon, or if you imagine doing it, take that big picture perspective, bird's eye perspective, what that does neurologically is it actually shifts us from being caught up in me, myself, and I, opens us into a more impersonal take on things, and it quiets activity in a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is where we go when we're ruminating, especially negatively ruminating about various things. Just that, the sense of things as a whole, the bigger picture, the wider view, but boom, has an immediate impact that's tracked neurologically by a shift from a lot of activation in the midline of the cortex, which is very caught up with mental time travel, going into the future or going into the past. And instead, when people have a sense of things as a whole, they quiet activity in that midline, including in the default mode network, which is toward the rear of it, and activate networks on the sides of their brain, particularly right-sided if they're right-handed, the opposite if they're left-handed, which are involved with holistic Gestalt processing. Just that sense of spaciousness, openness, is a fantastic thing that people can do in just a handful of seconds. And with time, you start to develop more of a sense of the trait, of that sense of spacious awareness in which various things are happening. Those are two examples.
Wow. Yeah.
All right, Forrest, are you doing these practices?
Great question. This is the question. 100% the money question right here from you, Ian. So I'm really glad you asked that. A couple of things to sort of dance around that a little bit. In short, much more these days than I used to, and I found them very fundamentally useful. My dad is totally a practice guy, so I'm glad that you asked him, what are the specific things we can do? That's absolutely his lane. And we talked about this a little bit when we had our conversation, actually. So much of this is about self-awareness, right? Because you can have a laundry list of practices and tactics and ideas. And then the question is, are you actually applying them? Are you actually doing the things that we say will theoretically make us feel better, make us show up better in the world? So the power is in the practice of raising the gaze or opening out away from us or activating those networks in the brain. But the trick is recognizing that you actually have to do that in the moment.
You know, it's so funny you should say this because I've read 1,000 books on meditation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes
great line.
So sometimes, you know, just you think that reading it is doing it, you know, and you just pat yourself on the back. But, you know, after a while, you're like, you know, you may better hit the cushion before you read another book and see if actually if doing it actually will yield the results that you're reading about. Right. And we'll hit meditation in a moment because I can't think of a better accelerant for some of the things that we're talking about. But Forrest, continue on about this question.
Yeah, no, I just think that this is the money question that we're engaging right now in the self-help, personal growth, psychology, all of that space. There's I believe that this line is from Jung. I want to give the proper attribution. It's the client doesn't need a new idea. The client needs a new experience. And that is what we're wrestling with in this entire industry, at least in my opinion, as somebody who has a podcast with 200 episodes full of great ideas for people. The fundamental question is, are you actually going to do the work? And man, it's hard to do the work sometimes.
You know, you really raise a great point, and I don't know how to answer this. Well, I mean, I can say this as someone who probably attends 4 12-step recovery meetings a week. Okay. And
that's real practice.
Yeah, that's very engaged. Yeah.
Yes, it's amazing how you can be inspired to practice something when your life's on the line. However, you know, although some don't, I guess. You know, I guess you know, in my experience there, one of the things that is so played up or emphasized is this idea of a spiritual experience. Like all of these things just don't matter unless you have first had a spiritual experience that underlies everything. You don't go to NA meetings or AA meetings or whatever your A is. Actually, initially you go because you think what you're going to be taught how to do is not to drink or drug. That is actually not what gets talked about in those meetings. It's not about technique or strategy. It's about how do you develop a spiritual worldview that actually can supplant and improve upon the experience you were looking for in drugs and drinking, right? Because once you take that out of the center of the human person, you got to replace it with something, right? Yeah. And some of these practices you're talking about, Bill Wilson was very attuned to. Really attuned to. You know, it's amazing that step 10 in the in our tradition talks about improving conscious contact with God through meditation. And that was written in 1935, or 1950 something by the time the 12 steps came out. Anyway, it's all about in the practice. It's not in the theory. It's in the practice. And I have to remember that just about all the time. The time.
Same.
So awakening, enlightenment.
And can I say too, it's about the practice, right? We tend to think it's about getting to a goal or to a certain place.
Yes, I agree. And I think, there's so much rich stuff to talk here. And I know that we only have just a little bit of time left, but I just feel, when you, I feel all shimmery right now. I feel
it's a good conversation.
I feel like I've got a little bit of, like my blood is carbonated right now, and it's kind of running through me, and I don't know where to stop.
Well, can I just toss something out there really quickly in terms of what Anthony was just saying? Because I think that this is also part of it. And I would love your take on this, Ian, as somebody who is so actively engaged with your own practice of going to those meetings that you were talking about a moment ago. A pattern that we see all the time in the personal growth therapy space is that somebody has a challenge, and then they have some kind of inciting incident. And you were talking about a kind of inciting incident there, Ian, when you talked about a spiritual experience. That's absolutely an inciting incident for a lot of people. And so they seek help, and they start taking on these practices that create a very meaningful, positive change in their life. They see themselves starting to get better. And then because they are getting better, they start to slide on the practices, right? They stop going to the meetings, or they stop following the diet that's making them feel better. Or they stop doing whatever it is that they're doing. And then they backslide. Of course they backslide because they're not doing the practice anymore. But they backslide and they go, oh, but I've put all this work in. Why am I just back where I started? And so we see this as this common pattern, right, that happens. And so it's not just about keeping on doing it when it's taking the pain away. It's about keeping on doing it even when you feel pretty good right now, because it's a preventative practice just as much as it's a recovery practice. And for me, when I kind of got that structurally, it was a total game changer for me in terms of my own engagement with things that were making me feel better in the world. And it just really upped my consistency.
Yes. One of the things that strikes me, and this is actually what I was going to try and get to when I was speaking earlier, and then I had to make up my answer because I couldn't remember it. You've done that before, don't lie. You get halfway through something, you go, why did I start talking about this? And then you have to push the BS button. So one of the things that seems to be absent to me, and this is one of the benefits of being in a 12-step community, is I think it's really hard to do this stuff alone.
For sure.
It's really hard to do it alone. And what I haven't seen a lot of discussion of is how do we form communities of people that are encouraging each other and sharing their obstacles and their successes on the journey toward achieving these 7 ways of being in the world, or sobriety, or however we want to put it. And I'm just wondering, are you guys feeling that too? How do you create communities of, maybe in a Sangha or in a centering prayer group or whatever it is? I don't think most people have those communities, and to do it alone is tough.
Well, I very much agree with you in general. I think there's diversity of different kinds. For me, one of the great benefits of encountering the Enneagram was realizing that my wife was not wrong or bad or mean. She was just a 6 and kind of raining on my parade. And it wasn't so personal. So there's diversity, and I think there really is diversity here. And some people are particularly supported by community. Other people get a lot of practice as a lone wolf, and they're sociable, but fundamentally they're more independent. So I think there's that kind of range to some extent. But in general, I certainly agree with you. It's interesting that in the Buddhist tradition, there's this emphasis on the 3 jewels, as it were, and community is right up there with the teacher and the body of information and the teachings. So you have the teacher, the teachings, and the community of the taught, essentially. It's really, really true. Maybe a last thing I'll just say is that I know this is central to your own work, Ian. At bottom, it's about love, really. it's easy to get schmaltzy about it, but it's beyond sentimentality. It's really about being aware of the kind of overflowing generosity of the universe, which is inherently the case, even if some of what is manifest is Putin invading Ukraine, or children going hungry in the streets of Oakland or Mumbai, right? It's all part of the whole thing. But the whole thing, as the whole thing, is perfect already. It's okay already. It is simply what it is, right? And its isness is extraordinarily loving in its generosity, its benevolence, its beneficence. So in that sense, I have found for myself that as my own practice is kind of, noodled along over the years, one mistake after another, that I come more and more back to the sense of the kind of inherent trustworthiness, the friendliness. That was Einstein's word. Is the universe a friendly place?
That's
the
what it was.
inherent
Thank
friendliness of existence.
Yeah,
And which means the inherent goodness and lovingness that's native to all of us, and to trust in that. I think that's one of the hardest things for people to trust, which is to say their own good nature. People are quicker to trust others than to deeply, deeply, deeply trust the goodness in themselves, and they have faith in it. I mean, that's one of the factors in Buddhist psychology, conviction, sometimes translated as faith, not so much in a higher power, but faith in the path, faith in the practice, faith in your goodness, faith in your friends, faith in your teachers, faith in the fact that if you lift the cup, you'll get some water, that kind of faith, practical faith, informed faith. And we can have that kind of faith in ourselves. And that's an incredible liberation.
All right, everybody, I am talking to Forrest and Rick Hansen. Rick has written this wonderful book, Neurodharma, New Science, Ancient Wisdom, and 7 Practices of the Highest Happiness. They are authors of a good number of other books. Forrest is co-author of this wonderful new book, Resilient. What's the subtitle again?
How to Grow an Unshakable Core of Calm, Strength, and Happiness. Yeah.
All right, Anthony, you need to read that. Okay, I'm just saying.
Somebody's projecting right now.
We're awash at just all the things during this conversation.
That's right, bald-faced projection. Shameless projection right there. And also this book I love, Buddha's Brain, the practical neuroscience of happiness, love, and wisdom. And one of the things that I have so enjoyed about this conversation, and we could do a whole other episode on it, is really the neuroscience of spirituality, whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu, whatever it is, right? That there is so much of spirituality how do I want to say this? Our appreciation for spirituality can be so enhanced by recognizing the neuroscience that runs behind it. Let me give you an example of this, Anthony, because I think this will help you. Because you need this help. So, when I realized from reading, around evolutionary psychology, that, for example, there's a reason you're afraid, Ian. Because all those years ago on the Serengeti, somebody was chasing your ass, and you really needed to be afraid a lot of the time. But you don't need to have that level of fear running in your life and tyrannizing your life in the present moment. And when that happens, it's not because you're a bad person or a weak person. It's just because, guess what? That mechanism is still alive and working in you, despite the fact that the same threats no longer are present. Am I getting this right, Forrest and Rick?
Absolutely.
You're so much
Bang
smarter
on.
than I am. And then that created a space for being self-observant, of being patient with myself, of saying, well, of course you're afraid. That's what humans do. And until such time, 10,000 years from now, that we're no longer, sort of held hostage by this, maybe we will not be as much, right? But what we're talking about is the understanding that comes to us, I think, through an understanding of the way that the nervous system works, the way that the brain works, and all this stuff. I just think it's so powerful, and I thank you for your work, Forrest and Rick. It's so fantastic, and I wish we were neighbors.
It would be very cool.
Wouldn't it? I would love it.
If I could, I want to just share like two kind of quotes with you. And first, I got to give Frieda from Reichman credit for the saying that Forrest talked about.
Yeah, especially to Young. It's
given that she was a woman kind of rebuking the male establishment. They don't need any more heady interpretations. They need experiences, So that part. First, you may know this one already, Ian and Anthony. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one. But the light bulb has to want to change. Right? It's kind of like a koan. It's great. And that's what Forrest was talking about. How the heart of the matter really is motivation and practice. And as you said earlier, Ian, the ways in which community can be a great support for motivation. And we practice with others, for others, and alongside others. So that part. And then the other saying is that your mind takes its shape from what it rests upon, for better or worse. And the modern update would be that with repetition, your nervous system, literally in terms of structure and function at the cellular and even molecular level, takes its physical shape from what it repeatedly rests upon, for better or worse. And so for me, the takeaway from that a little bit as a summary of practice is to rest your mind upon what draws your heart.
Beautifully said.
So gradually that becomes what dwells within you.
Ooh, that's good.
I'm thinking about even that great scriptural verse about as a person thinketh, so he is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
This is, again, one of those great truths that seems to pop up across traditions, so we should pay attention.
One of my personal little sayings in meditation is we become what we behold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And it's so interesting to ask this, what does draw our heart, right? Most people are drawn to what is beautiful and good and helpful, including in very simple ways. And then it's to kind of honor that a lot and then find the systems and structures like going to 4 meetings a week that help you keep, acting upon that draw. Who was it? It's one of these theologians, Alfred North Whitehead, one of these process theology, talk about the divine as luring us. That was the word. I think you would know better than I, Ian, right? We're being lured almost. We're drawn in that direction, and to listen to it and give over to it.
Well, everybody, I want to remind you that we are speaking with Forrest and Rick Hansen. Rick has this new book, Neurodharma, New Science, Ancient Wisdom, and 7 Practices of the Highest Happiness. Forrest, how do people learn more about what y'all are doing?
The best place to find us these days is probably on the Being Well podcast. You can find Being Well on any podcast platform. We release 1 episode a week. We talk to a bunch of fantastic people like Ian, who was on the podcast just recently. My dad, you can find his stuff at rickhansen.net. And also, honestly, one of the best ways is probably just to plug his name into Google and it'll all pop up for you.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, that's Hanson, not Sen, Hanson. I'm always spelling my name on podcasts. I have a much harder name to spell than you, Rick and Forrest. But I always want to make sure that people don't waste their time going to the wrong spelling, because that might be an owner of a used car lot somewhere in Topeka.
I feel like this has been a spa day, Ian.
Been a spa day. Yes, it's been a spa day.
Yeah, I'm swimming in it.
Right, so good.
I love that
so
line.
Good. Well, anyway, typology friends, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, may you have rest. Until next time.